All right, well, welcome to the bee meeting. We are actually recording the meeting as of now. So just start off with on Zoom, one of the features we have is a chat feature. And we're going to set it so that the meeting itself will have all participants muted unless I unmute you, just to help keep the noise down. If you have questions, please type them in the chat. Anyone will be able to respond to those so all the officers can see them and respond to the questions that you have. And we'll just kind of go through and have our meeting. We have a great presentation today by Kevin. Other than that, I'll give it over to Mike.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, this is our first Zoom meeting. I'm really excited about it. It's a fantastic server. I mean, it's amazing. The capabilities on this Zoom is amazing. So the future, whenever we have an in-person meeting at the library, we're also going to have Zoom on hand as well. So you'll be able to watch it from your home or anywhere else. You don't have to be in person at the library unless you really want to be. So we're going to have an in-person meeting, and it's going to be Zoomed as well. So that's a fantastic ability, because we were running out of space at the library. We were quickly growing to the size where we needed an option, and Zoom is it, I think. So it's going to be great, especially for the people that travel long distances. I travel from Fallon. A couple members travel from Lovelock. We have a new member from Bishop, and we have a longtime member from Urington as well. And that's quite a round trip, you know. So it's going to be great. And let's see. There's going to be a question and answer session after Kevin Burrell's presentation. So hold all your questions till after the presentation, and speak to Kevin first with all of your questions specific to Kevin, and then we're going to do beekeeping normal, Northern Nevada Beekeepers Association question and answer session at the end. I've got a few things to talk about. So well, without further ado, it's 6 o'clock, and looks like we have quite a few people online. And Kevin, thank you so much for coming back. You were a phenomenal speaker last year. Yeah, you passed so much information that I couldn't catch it all in one presentation, so I had to invite you back.
Well, thanks.
So,
I appreciate it.
Could you introduce yourself, Kevin?
Yeah, I can definitely do that. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to set things up, and then I'll get started. How's that look to everybody?
Good.
Good. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I do appreciate everybody tuning in. I always appreciate having the chance to talk to folks about some of the work that I do. And the work that I do is kind of twofold. You may have seen my name in a couple different places. On the one hand, I started with my wife, Nevada Bugs and Butterflies, which is a science education nonprofit. We're based in Reno, and in the past, we've done school outreach events, as well as had a seasonal science center and butterfly house where we do a lot of our science education, and we're working on a new place for that as things begin to settle down in the next year. And then the other hat that I wear is I work for the University of Nevada Extension. I work out of the Washoe County office, and I'm an integrated pest management educator. And so I do a lot of education on pest management strategies, especially for insect pests, because it's my specialty. I'm learning a little bit about plant pests, certainly living in Nevada. And then a large part of the grant that I'm on, which is a USDA grant, is focused on pollinator health. And so I'll talk about some of my major work with that at the end of this presentation. But today I'm going to talk about pretty much, it's fun. I do sometimes find myself coming into talks and doing the talk on something else that's not really the topic. And so here I am at a beekeeping conference, and I'm going to tell you about everything that's not a honeybee. So hopefully this will give you a little bit of roundness to seeing what's out flying around on the flowers that you plant for your honeybees and what you see when you're out for walks in the wildlands and so on. And I'm going to focus partly on bees because they are the most important pollinators, but I'm also going to focus on some other animals that you might see visiting flowers. And one group of those are wasps. and wasps sometimes get a bad name, but many wasps are friendly. And here we have a wasp that you can see has some pollen grains on its back of its head and thorax right there. So you know it's moving some pollen, probably from this yarrow flower it's on. But you know it's a good person because it's got a little smiley face on its back. So you know that it's on the right side of things here. So with that, we'll move into the talk. And there's 4 quick sections that we're going to go through. I'll talk about some of the diversity of pollinators and their biology. I will have a quick section on some of the things I think are fun about native bees. And I'll also do a quick run through some of the identification of bees that you might see in the backyard and in your garden. I'll talk a little bit about other things that visit flowers that have some uses that might be really nice for us. And then I'll finish off talking a little bit about creating habitat for pollinators and some plants. And I do think it's worth reminding folks, you know, I think pollination is 1/2, right, of the honeybee equation, and the other half, as far as the kind of value of honeybees, is towards the honey side of it. So some people really go towards honeybees for the honey. And so I think it's worth remembering what pollination is. And it's just getting the reproductive parts from the male part of a plant to a female part of the plant. And in this picture, the male parts of the plant are right here, and the female parts of the plant are right here. And if any of you were looking at your apple flowers a couple weeks ago, you would have seen flowers that look very much like this. The male and female parts of the plant are right next to each other. So it shouldn't be that hard for them to get the pollen to the female part of the plant. And in fact, a lot of plants can self-fertilize. They can use the pollen from their own plant to create offspring, seeds. On the other hand, most plant species are either better off or they require their pollen to go from one plant to a different plant. That's called outcrossing, and there's lots of benefits to it. And there's lots of ways that plants can outcross, that they can get this pollen from one plant to another. One of the most common ways is wind. If you think about corn, corn is wind pollinated. On the other hand, about 3/4 of flowering plant species are aided by the use of an animal or a different type of organ, you know, some other organism in getting that pollen from one plant to another. And so that's the role that pollinators play. And there are a whole slew of pollinators that are in North America and around the world. But as you are probably most familiar with, bees are the most important pollinators, and that's because they have that intimate pollen collecting relationship. They have those structures, they're after the pollen in particular, and they're really the only major group of animals that's after the pollen. Other groups of animals that you see here are mainly after the nectar, and so if the pollen gets on their bodies and they move it to another plant, that's great. But some of these animals have developed pretty specific relationships in different areas with plants. And for example, wasps and flies are very important high desert pollinators in our area. If it's not pollinated by a bee, it's very likely pollinated by a wasp or a fly, especially these short open flowers like yarrow. And flies are often used in greenhouse seed production of certain crops. Carrots in particular are seed crops are pollinated by flies. And flies are often the main pollinators at high elevations. So any of you that do hikes to the higher elevation parts of the Sierras or even you know, high elevation sites like Mount Grant or the Whites, flies become the main pollinators of plants above 10,000 feet. And so they're very important. Butterflies and moths are often what I call incidental pollinators. They're just pollinating, like I said, because they happen to touch the pollen. But in the tropics, there are some really specialized relationships, especially between moths and particular flower species where they're mutualists. They require each other. And so they can be really interesting. We use them more in bugs and butterflies because they're friendly and they don't bite or sting like bees do. So they can be really good kind of charismatic microfauna. The other two groups of pollinators that we have here are beetles and hummingbirds and bats. And beetles were some of the first pollinators on the scene evolutionarily. So I like to give them their due, but you won't see them doing a lot of active pollinating around here. And then hummingbirds and bats, especially in hot deserts and in the tropics. But some plants up here are real favorites of hummingbirds, and then bats, some night pollinators. So I want to talk a little bit about bee diversity and why I think it's important to learn about bee diversity. And the main reason that I talk about native bees in Nevada is because we have a lot of them. Bee diversity, like the diversity of other plants and animals, is not evenly distributed around the globe. But unlike most plants and animals, which are most diverse in the tropics and become less diverse as they leave the tropics, bees are most diverse in arid desert regions that you can see highlighted. If you go to Google and you Google pictures of Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, you would be amazed how much that looks like Yerington and Hawthorne. They're very, very similar in their overall climate, and bees like those areas for probably a lot of different reasons. But you can see highlighted here is the Western US, kind of the whole region of the Western North America, and we really are a biodiversity hotspot for bees. And so if we zoom in a little bit on this, here's Nevada, and you can see that the exterior of the Great Basin, this is a heat map where hotter colors represent higher levels of bee diversity. The exterior of the Great Basin has something like 1,100 species in it, with many still in the interior of the Great Basin. So that rivals these areas of coastal California that we think of as being kind of ultra diverse plant spots. And it makes us one of the most diverse areas in the continent for bee diversity. So just taking a look around at some of the bees that are here, we have kind of a smattering of them on this poster here, which you can purchase actually, and I think I have details on that because a lot of people like this poster. There are about 4,000 species of bees in North America, and as I am sure you are familiar, but just to remind you, of course, that does not include the European honeybee. We consider that non-native. It's a cultivated species, and so discounting that, we have about 4,000 species of bees in North America, between 800 and 1,100 species of bees in Nevada. So we have 25% of the continent's bee diversity just here in our state, which is pretty awesome. Some of the major differences between these bees and honeybees, the main one that I'll kind of expound upon in a bit is that most of them are solitary. As opposed to having a queen and nurses and workers, these bees mostly take care of their own young, each mom caring for her own young without communal care. And there are exceptions to that. Some sweat bees actually have communal care, and bumblebees are social species as well. But well over 90% of the bee species are solitary. 3/4 of these bee species will nest in the ground, in little burrows in the ground, and the remainder of those will nest in hollowed out wood cavities. So the nesting structure is very different than what you might be used to, and I'll show you some photos of that here coming up. And yes, you can get this. This is by our friends. They've co-authored a really amazing book that I happen to have here called The Bees in Your Backyard. If this is of interest to you, I would highly recommend this book, and they make this poster as well, and you can find it on Etsy. So if that's your thing, I like to give them props. They do bee diversity research all over the Western US. They're wonderful folks. So all of the pollinators that are insects that I mentioned go through complete metamorphosis, and this really influences a lot of their biology. So I want to go into it a little bit. And it's just the butterfly life cycle, which means they have a larval life stage whose goal is to eat and grow, and an adult life stage whose goal is to mate and lay eggs and disperse, and they get between those two with a pupal stage. So on the left, we have a typical solitary bee existence where it starts off as an egg laid in a burrow that's made by mom. Mom provisions the young with a big ball of pollen. The egg hatches and the larva eats it to grow, finishes growth and pupates all underground, and then emerges above ground as an adult to find flowers to forage on. And so there's a few things that are really specific that come out of this life cycle. And the one is right here, which is that their adult life cycle, both the length of it and when it occurs, are really closely timed to the flowers that are out. Unlike honeybees, which are available to forage all through the year, these bees are only going to be above ground typically for 4 to 6 weeks, and that needs to be when the flowers that they need are available. And some native bees are generalists. They can visit all different types of flowers. Some native bees are specialists. They can only visit one or a few different species of flowers to forage for the pollen for their young. So it's totally variable across the spectrum. Other things that come out of this are noting that the rest of the year for them is spent below ground in one location. So unlike things that migrate, these animals, or that just kind of recolonize northern areas each year, these bees are below ground the rest of the year. And so if you manage your landscape in a way that has a lot of disturbance for these areas, you might want to take into account that there could be a lot of things nesting below ground. And that's not just bees, that's flies and wasps as well. The last thing that's really closely timed because of this life cycle is the mating process. And in bumblebees, it's somewhat similar to honeybees, where you have unmated queens, princesses, and males come out at the same time and find each other midair and mate. And then in the case of the bumblebees, the male will crawl off and die, and the female will go on a really intense foraging bout and then burrow down to spend the winter. And she's the only one who will found a new hive in the coming spring. But the timing of this is obviously very important. In solitary species, males will often emerge first and wait nearby burrows for females to emerge so they can be first on the scene for the mating process. So that timing, again, is very closely regulated. And so the overall picture that I like to shape for people is just that it is easy to remember the adult food source that bees need and other pollinators like wasps and flies, because for all of them as adults, it is nectar. But as young, they need something totally different, right? The adult bees need the nectar, but the young bees need the pollen. If you are a butterfly, you're a caterpillar foraging on plants. And if you're a wasp or the types of flies that I'll talk about, you need a prey item. And so this is where these things can be really important in pest management, is because they can harvest our pests for us as a part of their life cycle. And then lastly, they need a place to live. And so like I've mentioned, that's either a hole in the ground or a hole in some wood. If you're a male bee, you don't make a burrow, and you'll often just clasp to the end of a grass stem or a branch. And then if you're a caterpillar, you get to stay on the plant. So that's kind of nice. So a little bit more, just to show you some fun pictures of native bees foraging that I think are kind of cool and that highlight a couple aspects of their biology. The main thing that you probably saw in that poster is that there's huge size variation in native bees. They go from very tiny to extraordinarily large carpenter bees. In this bottom right, these are two different closely related carpenter bees, but one is a fraction of the size of the other. So this small bee may only move a couple hundred meters from its burrow to the foraging resources, whereas this big carpenter bee or our giant Nevada bumblebee might go a couple miles between its foraging location and its home. So when we think about landscape connectivity for wildlife, this is one example of that, where we need their living habitat to be somewhat close to where they're doing their foraging in order for them to have a really healthy existence. Some examples of native bee nests. A lot of times they look like this. This is a digger bee, and it has a small burrow in the ground. And if any of you have walked around in the desert a long enough time, you know that there's no shortage of small holes in the ground that are not always populated with things. It can be very hard to know if the hole that you're looking at is a bee nest or a wasp nest or a fly or a trekking pole hole, right? It can be hard to know. But sometimes they have little turrets and things that kind of are exposed on the surface. These might be for predator avoidance or flood avoidance or airflow or who knows, but they can often indicate that you're looking at a bee burrow. And bumblebees, for reasons that are not always entirely clear, really like already excavated burrows. So we find them a lot in abandoned rodent burrows. And if you dug into this here where you saw bumblebees flying in and out of, you would see the small hive with nurses there taking care of the young. They have honey for them there, a little bit, right? Not enough to harvest, and they don't overwinter, so they don't keep it. But they have a little bit of honey, and then these would be where the pupae are developed. A little bit more on nesting material. There's one family of bees that I'll talk about in a little bit that all use additional nesting materials to make their nests. And this is one example. This is a leaf cutter bee with a leaf clipping underneath her. She'll take that back and line her nest with it. That would look something like this on the bottom right. Sometimes they use flower petals, which makes these linings very, very pretty pastel colors. And then this is a mason bee masticating up a piece of a manzanita leaf at the May Arboretum that I saw. And so she's gonna make that into a pulp and line her nest with that. So on the other side of the bee foraging equation is the pollination that we get out of it. And I know that this is not what most of you are doing with your honeybees. I don't think you probably have that many. You're working on a home scale, but it's important to remember a lot of our food is produced in this very way. And there's lots of reasons why we do it that way, partly because we need a lot of space at once for a crop. That's our problem. But honeybees are very good at pollinating because they have very high flower fidelity, and there are lots of them, and we can manage them very closely. But I do like to point out to folks that previous to our bringing honeybees over to the New World, all of the pollination that native populations needed was done by native bees. And it might be this sort of bee right here going around with his beautiful yellow pantaloons, visiting rabbit brush in the off season, and then in the springtime, it's visiting our crop plants. And so they really were successful at 100% of the pollination needs pre-introduction of white settlers. And I just think that it can be easy to be lost in the fact that honeybees are such good pollinators. And so I like to give a couple examples of where native bees shine in pollination. And so one of those is in orchard, fruit crops, fruit and nut crops in particular. One of those types of bees that uses additional nesting material we call orchard bees or mason bees. And these are more and more popular as managed populations of pollinators for orchard crops. And that is because they can be at least 5 times as effective and sometimes much more effective at pollinating these open Rosaceae flowers than honeybees. And part of the reason for that is, unlike most other bees that collect the pollen on the legs, this family of bees collects it on their abdomen, on the bottom of their belly. And when they get to these flowers to collect the pollen, they wade through it and they kind of waddle their body and they swim through this flower. And that swimming action is real messy, and it's extraordinarily good at pollinating those flowers versus honeybees, which obviously aren't going through that process to kind of comb that pollen onto the legs. So that's one example. A different example is buzz pollination. Buzz pollination is maybe most famously done by bumblebees, but this is a sweat bee picturing in the picture here on a solanaceous flower. And I saw milkweed on the Nevada buzz slide on the start of things. Milkweed is another type of plant, just like tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers, that has a different type of pollen structure. And some of you may be familiar with this. Instead of having individual pollen grains that fly apart, it has its pollen in a big, cohesive clump that's called a pollinium. And that pollinium doesn't break apart very easily on its own. It's most easily broken apart by a bee. And what this sweat bee is doing here is it is bitten down on the pollinium, and at the same time, it's vibrating its wings. Now, normally when you vibrate your wing muscles, you fly away, right? That is what those things do. But in this case, these groups of bees can detach their wings from their wing muscles. So when they vibrate the wing muscles, their whole body shakes at a C note. And that shaking, combined with breaking apart this pollinium, causes the pollen grains to fly off and around. And they'll collect a lot of that and comb it onto their body, and some of it will be broken and get onto the female part of the plant. So if you have tomatoes in the outside and you don't have any pollinators, they can be wind pollinated, but they will be they'll have a higher success of pollination if they're pollinated by these bees, because they have this process. If you have tomatoes in a greenhouse without ambient access to pollinators, they have a couple options. You can buy what's called a sonicator, and it looks like a cross between a tuning fork and an electric toothbrush, and you physically touch each and every tomato flower in the line down your tomato plants in your greenhouse, and that's how they pollinate them. Or you can bring in an eastern species of bumblebee that's one of the only managed bumblebee species, and you can bring that into the greenhouse and let them pollinate your tomatoes. And they have actually found that tomatoes that are pollinated by an animal taste better than tomatoes that are pollinated by the human hand. Probably some sort of pollen selection thing going on with the way the bee shakes the pollen loose, but very cool finding nonetheless. So a really great example of where native bees shine in pollination. And then the last one, just as an example, is alfalfa seed production. So this bee pictured here is the alkali bee, and it's not on alfalfa in this photo, but it is it has historically been one of the main native pollinators of alfalfa plants. And the reason for that is that alfalfa is a legume, and legume flowers have a funny structure to them, and the anthers are curved along one edge of the flower. Sometimes the upper side, I think sometimes the underside. And when a bee crawls into that flower to get the nectar, those anthers move. They're kind of bolted upward and they hit the bee in the butt. And that is how the pollen gets on that bee, is those anthers are mobile and they pop up and hit it in the butt. Well, honeybees don't like that, and they'll stop foraging on alfalfa and other legumes because of that. Native bees are often not as opposed to that, and the alkali bee is one of those. And so even though alfalfa is an introduced plant, the alkali bees were excellent pollinators of it. And the alkali bees live in huge congregations in alkali flats, in playas. And so not as much in Nevada, but especially in Eastern Oregon and Washington, playa protection and alkali bee nesting colony protection are huge agricultural efforts to protect this bee for alfalfa seed production. Okay, so I would be remiss if I gave a whole talk on bees to beekeepers and didn't talk a little bit about bee identification. So I'll do my best to do just an easy little bit of things that I hope will be useful for you. And at the end, I'll tell you that there's a guide available online. So that's kind of nice. So when it comes to bee identification, some of you may be familiar with this through your interest with honeybees, but I just want to go over some of the ideas of taxonomy, which is just classifying these different types of bees into different smaller groups. So bees, ants and wasps and sawflies, which you may be less familiar with, are all in the order Hymenoptera. And then our bees are just going to be in different families. So if you're looking at the honeybee, it's the genus Apis and the species Mellifera, and it's also in the family Apidae. But this, we're going to be working, when we talk about differentiating different types of native bees, I'm mainly focusing at the family level, and that's because there's 6 different North American bee families. So you only have to know 6 different things, right? If you could just get it down to family, you can feel real good about basic bee ideas. And before, whoop, sorry, there's supposed to be photos there. I do not know. I'm seeing some other photo issues, so I'm going to get some things started here just in case I have to have a backup presentation, because sometimes that happens, so be patient. So mimicry is really confusing for people, and I just like to address it because it's one of the main barriers when it comes to insect identification. Here, give me one moment and let me try and switch into a presentation. I have a backup copy of this. I'm going to try and open up a different file. Give me one moment, everybody. This is just the nature of things. See how this looks. Well, most things look good, but I do have a few photo issues. I apologize for that. Let me see what else I can do here. I won't spend more than another minute on this, but I will see what I can do. I have all these presentations fairly close at hand, so it's not that difficult to switch between them as I need to. Yeah, here we go. We'll just do this right now, and then I'll switch back when I need to. Okay, yeah, that's better. So, so it is really hard to identify these little flying things when there's 20 of them on a flower and they're all moving from flower to flower. It's just very difficult, and I'd like to acknowledge that. And that's the evolutionary phenomena of mimicry, and it's really super widely distributed. Things mimic other things all across the planet. And so there's different reasons why they mimic each other. One of them is if you have two species that are well protected in some way, for example, they both sting, and it's easier for big dumb mammals like us to recognize one search image versus two. And so because of that, things evolve over time to look like each other because it gives them a benefit overall of us not getting stung by them and not interfering with their livelihood and their behavior, because it's easier for us to recognize that. And so that's Eulerian mimicry, and that's something like the wasp and the fly, wasp up top and the fly in the middle. The bee in the middle. Batesian mimicry, on the other hand, is where you have an unprotected species that's trying to trick predators into thinking it's well protected. And so that's something like this fly here, which is a very convincing wasp mimic, but is in fact definitely not a wasp and will not sting you because it cannot. But it's gaining some benefit if, as a big dumb mammal, I see a black and yellow stripy thing and I back away from the flower before interfering with it. So that's the benefit that they're getting out of that. And it does make it very difficult. So when it comes to identifying bees versus flies, I just like to point out some of the differences. One of those is that, of course, bees usually have these pollen collecting hairs on the back legs, some of them on the bottom of the abdomen. The other two differences are in the front. Bees have big eyes, big bee eyes. Flies have enormous eyes that almost touch on the top of the head. And then the other part of that is that they have short antennae versus a bee's, very normal length insect antennae. So if you see something on a flower and it has eyes that are almost touching and then very, very stubby antenna, that is very much likely a fly. Versus something else that's flying around is a little bit fuzzier with these regular antennae, that's going to be it. So when it comes to some different groups of bees looking from a distance, the largest family of bees is Apidae. That's what honeybees are in. And the most diverse group of apid bees are bumblebees. Or one of the more noticeable groups of apid bees are bumblebees. There are 46 species of bumblebees in North America. We have 23 of them in Nevada. We have half of the nation's bumblebee diversity in our state. It's really awesome. And like I've already mentioned, they make a little bit of honey, which is cool. They're our main group of social bees, and they are also capable of buzz pollination. So they're really amazing fellows, for sure. Other examples of common bees that are apid bees, carpenter bees, they tend to look like bumblebees, but they're much less hairy, and they're often all black and shiny. These, unlike other types of wood-dwelling bees, they make their own holes in wood. That's why they're called carpenter bees. Most bees use pre-existing holes, but these ones will make their own. On the bottom, we have squash bees here. These bees tend to look like small honeybees. They can be hard to distinguish. Although with a trained eye, you are probably better off at doing that than me. And they are cucurbit specialists. They'll often nest underneath the squash that they pollinate. The males will rest in them overnight. And they're specialists of both cultivated and wild cucurbits. On the right, we have two examples, maybe not great photo examples of longhorn bees. These are often sunflower specialists, and they're very diverse. So what you can notice here is the males have antennae that are as long as the body sometimes. And you'll see several of them on a flower at once. Often the males will be resting in a small group all together. And if you notice things that are about half the size of honeybees and they just are jumping on and off of the flower, they just bounce right off and on this sunflower, those are likely longhorn bees. The family I mentioned that requires additional nesting materials are in the family Megachilidae. These are all things that require things like mason, little mortar to make their nest cells, or leaf clippings to make their nest cells. And as I might have mentioned, all of these carry their pollen collecting hairs under the abdomen. So you can see that here while they're in flight, and you can see it here while they're on a flower. That covering is all pollen on the underside of the belly. So it makes them a little bit easier to distinguish. The other easily distinguishable groups of bees are mason bees because they're kind of shiny and big, stout bees. Another family of bees that's got some noticeable representatives is Halictidae. These are often called sweat bees because they are sometimes attracted to salt, although I rarely actually see that. Some of them are very, very small. This is a Halictus sweat bee that's wrapped around a single anther of a phacelia flower, so a very, very tiny little bee. Some of them are brightly colored, especially green representatives. These are actually, maybe, I'm not exactly sure that they are, but it's possible that these are the same species. This bee up here with this really striking yellow and black abdomen is a male Agapostemon sweat bee. Only the males have that black and yellow abdomen. So that's a great example of Batesian mimicry. This bee, as a male, cannot sting, but it's hoping that you'll think it can sting as a wasp. And so it's developed that striking pattern. The females are often open. One other bee I like to give its due. I don't have any really great photos of these on my own, but this is the mining bee family. As it suggests, they live in the ground and they often make a central cavity and then branches off of it with a burrow at the bottom of each one. They're often early season and they're often flower specialists. If you see a small bee that's not really identifiable as anything else and it's the first thing you see in the season, it's probably a mining bee. They can be really hard to ID, but they're very, very cool and diverse in our region. So I do like to mention. Okay, I think I'm going to switch back to the other presentation because I think I'll be back to a place. It must have been a photo transfer that caused that issue. So I believe if I go back to the regular talk now, I should be able to go back. Yeah. Okay. So I want to bring in just a little bit about other flower visitors that you might see in the garden. And the main reason I bring these in is they can be very important towards integrated pest management. And as I mentioned, that's my job at Extension. So I do want to give a quick shout out to these animals that you may see visiting flowers that are very, very important. And these mainly fall, there's a whole slew of strategies that is incorporated into integrated pest management. But we're really talking about biological control here, one of these higher levels of control on different types of pests. And biological control uses what we call natural enemies. These are just things that eat the things we consider pests. And it often is this kind of fox and the hare dynamic where you always have to have one to have the other. And so it will mean that you're not getting rid of every single pest, but it can be a very long-term effective way to control pest populations and a way to avoid using chemical pesticides. And there are different types of biological control. One of the most common ones is classical biological control. And one example of that is just ladybugs for aphids, which you're probably familiar with, where you go buy them at a nursery and you release them in the morning, and hopefully you do it when it's cool or you do it at night. And they hopefully control the aphids by eating them. But this type of control means you're going to have to go back sometime in the future and buy more ladybugs, maybe next year, maybe next month. But they're not going to stick around and create a sustainable population in a way that controls pests. This other type of control, though, conservation biological control, focuses on bringing in native predators and parasitoids and bringing them in to control pests in your property. So these are things that typically feed on nectar as adults, but they're predators as larvae. And so these can be super beneficial to preventing pests from coming onto your property in large numbers. And so I want to show you some examples of those. Probably the most diverse, one of the more diverse groups of flower visitors are predatory wasps. So some of these are generalists. This little one down here is feasting on a tiny aphid, but it might feast on a lot of small things. Red-waisted wasps are often, though not always, caterpillar hunters. Some of them are named based on the prey that they hunt, like a cicada killer or a tarantula hawk. And then we have many common types of sand wasps that feast on other types of flying insects. Many of these have very specific diets. And so I want to make a strong point to distinguish these from European paper wasps and yellow jackets, which have some beneficial aspects, but are much more generalist in their diet. So none of the wasps on this page are going to come after your soda for the sugar or come after your hamburger for the meat. They need something much more specific. Some beetles will visit flowers. Some of them are just predators, and I have some other examples of those. But these two types of beetles you may see in your flowers, and they're called checkered flower beetles. And they are often seen with their head in a flower and their butt up in the air. But these are predators as larvae. So they're another common one that you'll see if you take close looks at flowers. Two other groups that you might be more familiar with. One group of flies called syrphid flies. They have this very caterpillar-like appearance. Very caterpillar-like appearance as larvae, and they're often really voracious aphid specialists. They can be very brightly colored, and they can be bee or wasp mimics as adults. And you can see a couple examples of that here. And then the last group of predators that I like to make mention of, because sometimes people don't recognize them, are lacewings and their close relatives, snakeflies. Snakeflies around here are brown, and they look like this, but with a really long giraffe-like neck. So these are often, they look, I couldn't find a good photo to use. They look like fuzzy caterpillars is what they look like, and they are also voracious aphid predators as larvae, and these also as adults. All of those will visit flowers. The last thing that will visit flowers that's very underrepresented, and so I want to give it its due, is a group of animals that are called parasitoids. Parasitoids, it's a term that sounds like parasites, and there's a couple differences. Parasitoids are free living for part of their life cycle, and then they use a host for another part of their life cycle. The other difference is that they typically kill that animal that's their host as a part of their development. So at the bottom here, I have 3 different wasp species that are parasitoids of the dreaded tomato hornworm here. So some of you are probably familiar with that through poor luck with a tomato plant. What you see on the outside here are cocoons. These wasps were larvae inside this caterpillar. They ate it for its development and then emerge as fully grown larvae to pupate on the outside and then emerge as adults, which will then drink nectar. So these tiny little wasps, which you will never notice on a flower unless you're doing a survey, all need nectar as adults in order to survive and disperse. But they're using these caterpillars as hosts, and they're great pest control. The one thing I'd point out here, this is 1 species of caterpillar, 3 species of wasps parasitizing it. So they're very, very diverse, and they're this huge group of organisms that you just don't see much of. A different example of one, flies are another group that contains parasitoids. This is a tachinid fly that's a ladybug mimic, and it lays its eggs on the outside of true bugs like this, which are oftentimes major pests of caneberries and other crops like that. And it will go inside that animal and eat it from the inside out for its development and kill that bug as a part of the process. So just a really kind of underrepresented side of flower visitors, but I know that you're providing nectar for your bees, and so I want to give you some added benefits that you're also providing for other animals. Okay, for the last section here, I'm actually not going to talk about pesticides and herbicides. I want to make a brief mention of protecting managed pollinators and then talk a little bit about habitat here. And the brief mention of this is just a push for our partners at the Department of Ag. They have created a pollinator protection plan for managed pollinators that can be moved from place to place. These are honeybees, mason bees, and some bumblebees, like I've mentioned. And so all I want to do is encourage you to keep the dialogue open. If any of you are new beekeepers, make sure you mention to your neighbors that you keep bees, so that they know if they're spraying herbicides or pesticides, they can keep this open dialogue, and you can move bees as needed if somebody needs to spray something that could be dangerous, right? And so I just take this time to put out the kumbaya pitch, which is, instead of creating what can be a controversial relationship where you feel like you can't talk to your neighbors who are spraying things and you don't know what they're spraying, you know, make that effort to create the dialogue and find out what they're using and create a healthy situation between you and your neighbors when it comes to that sort of thing. When it comes to native pollinators, though, we can't move them around. All we can focus on is creating habitat. And so the main points are that in addition to the foraging habitat, they need soil and soil nesting materials, and they need those things to be pesticide free. So again, like I mentioned, in addition for a hole in the ground or a wood cavity for this leafcutter bee, she also needs that leaf to be pesticide free. And then we want to select plant species, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. A word about keeping native bees. I know that mason bees are a very up and coming choice for homeowners to play around with. So I just wanted to give people a couple keys to success if you are trying to incorporate bees in addition to honeybees. You'll often see them as bee houses or bee hotels that are frames made with hollow reeds stuffed in them for the bees to use. But there are some key points that can make something a very good bee house or a bad bee house. So the main point is that the reeds need to be at least 6 inches long, preferably longer. A lot of the ones that you see nowadays have 4 or 5 inch long reeds. And like I mentioned at the beginning, the males are laid on the outside and the females are laid in the back. And if you have short reeds, you end up with just male bees, which is bad for obvious reasons. So they need to be at least 6 inches long, or 7 is ideal, I think. And then various sizes for various native bees is really beneficial, right? You don't need to have just one size hole. Variation is the spice of life. There are all different size native bee species that use these cavities. The next most important point is that, just like you might imagine, these holes can build up pathogens and parasites in them, and so it's best that they be replaced every couple of years. So if you have some that have pupae in them, you take them out after the second year and you set them in a safe place nearby, and then you put the bee house, you put new stuff in the bee house to replace it every couple of years. Ideally, they face east or southeast with an eave over top to protect from the sun a little bit. You want to avoid having that direct western sun exposure. And then lastly, some people will bring them in the winter. This is mainly to increase overwintering survival and to decrease parasitism rates of the pupae. Make sure you bring them back out in time because they can emerge much earlier than you think. You'd want them in a room that's cool but not too cold. And lastly, I would just add that it's not necessary to do this unless the pollination aspect of it is your main goal of cultivating these and it's very important to you. Otherwise, I suggest that natural kind of selective events are probably a good part of the process. When it comes to developing these habitats, they can be a range of shapes or sizes, and there are different books that can help you define these, and it's all just about whether you're planting in big trees like fruit trees, or whether you want small forbs like penstemon and yarrow, whether you want things that are annual or perennial, whether you care if they're native or not native plants, and how much you want to water them, right? Do you want to water your lavender and your salvia, or do you just want to have some globe mallow seed that you throw out and forget and never have to water it? All of these are choices you can make. But the highlights are that you want to try and clump plants together because it's easier for pollinators to find a big group of flowers versus an isolated flower. And you want to go for as much diversity as you can manage. If you take nothing else away from this part of the talk, plant as many different things as you can manage. Because like I mentioned, things are generalists, things are specialists, bees are out early, bees are out late season, and you want to try and provide foraging resources for them. So in this sense, it's very similar to honeybee foraging. We find that ideally you'd like to have at least 3 species blooming at all times. And some bees prefer red flowers, some prefer purple. So varieties of bloom colors, bloom shapes, bloom sizes. Again, diversity is the spice of life. So just a kind of schematic example of that to give you an idea for what this would look like. You have the clumps of different types of flowers. We have some structural components for male bees to hang out, or maybe for bumblebees to nest underneath, some rocks for visual interest, and so on. I like to show you that this can be done in a small yard. This is, a lot of work to be sure, but this is in a Northeast Sparks urban neighborhood of an acquaintance of ours. You can see there's different flower shapes, colors, sizes. There's some yet to bloom. He's even got some some rotting fruit for things that are attracted to sugar in that way. One thing that you don't see here is native soil. The cobble is not ideal for bee nesting habitat, but I can tell you that just to the back side of this photo is the east side of Sparks. It's the desert going off into the Pahrump area, so or the Para area. So there's a lot of sand nearby. If you are looking for some examples of habitats, I can give you a couple that are open to the public. One of those is at the south end of the University of Nevada campus. It's called the Biggest Little Pollinator Garden. It is in the quad of the Fleischman Agriculture Building, which is just off of 9th Street and Evans. 9th and Evans. And you can go there. It's in the quad. And if you were to go right now, I bet it is booming. I bet things look amazing. It's one of the more established gardens in the area. I think it might be 6 years old now. And it was established by some really dedicated folks at the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nevada Native Plant Society. And a lot of these plants are labeled as well. I can see some buckwheat here and a couple different types of penstemons and some milkweed up here. However, as a part of my grant with the USDA, I have established a set of demonstration pollinator gardens, which are in various stages of development. The one that is closest to us is at the Washoe County Extension Office. It's just east of the airport off of Rock Boulevard on Energy Way. And I have a few general goals with this. One was to create a demo garden that people could come and see. Another was to find some plants that did well in a broad range of habitats across the state. And another was to find some plants that looked nice enough to be horticultural, landscapey sort of plants. And I will say, I think I've had some success. These are just, you know what, I'll go back later. I had some other photos of plants, but these are some examples of pollinators on various plants that are all at the Washoe County office. All of these are things you can see there that are in bloom. These here are on a desert marigold, Baelia multiradiata. These are on globe mallow, Spiralcia. These are Prince's Plume. That's a perennial mustard plant. These three are on a native hardy geranium, including this syrphid fly here. It's called a bird hoverfly. These two are on buckwheat. And then these bees that are mating on a little penstemon. So kind of cool to show the flowers as a mating site as well as a foraging site. And these bees do not look like bees, do they? Those are masked bees. They're in the genus Hylaeus, and they store their pollen in an internal crop, which is one of the coolest things. So they're like birds, right? They have an internal crop that they store their pollen in. So they don't have the pollen collecting hairs to store it on the outside of their body, which is super cool. So if you're interested in this, this is a list of some of the easiest plants, some of which I have already mentioned. Globe mallows, penstemons, and buckwheats are some of those. Milkweeds I saw already mentioned. Common yarrow is not as popular as a bee plant, but it is a very good wasp and fly attractant. And then two other things I like to make mention of. It can be hard to get nectar and pollen sources for early season and late season. So my recommendations for early season are willows, and my recommendation for late season is rabbit brush. Those are the best things that you can get for those to kind of fill those edges. The reason all of these are on this list is because they're almost all available from the Nevada Division of Forestry Nursery that's in Washoe Valley. If you email them, I believe they are taking people by appointment at this point, although I'm not positive of that. You should email them to be sure. They have their inventory online, and their lead, Ryan, and all of their staff are super helpful at picking out plant species. So if you want to know what's a good pollinator, he can tell you just as well as I can, almost definitely better. But if you're a little scared of native plants and you just want to focus on non-native things because they're a little easier, these are my general suggestions. We had all of these in our butterfly house that we use because they bloom for a long time and they're very attractive to all sorts of different things, and they put out a lot of flowers. So this is, let's see if I can find, here it is. This is a thyme flowers that this white is on. This is a sedum that's a real nice late season plant. Doesn't bloom until at least mid-August. And then this is on an anise hyssop plant. So that's a nice mint that you get some dual function. So just some things to take home would be that, you know, I hope I've convinced you that our native insect life cycles are really complex and sensitive to environmental timings and to some disturbances, that our native pollinators that we have are very good garden pollinators. They do a lot of hard work. They can also be really great pest control, and I encourage you to expand your thinking when it comes to flying insects, to incorporate using native insects as pest control. That is where I'm going to put my push in the coming years for sure. And that you can create habitat in your own backyard that can provide a really thriving foraging resource for a large array of native pollinators. So with that, I'll put up my contact information. I'll say thanks, and I have other slides that go in a little more in depth into some of the flower species if people want to talk about that I can pull up on other presentations. So with that, I'll leave this slide up for a minute, but if you want to pull up the chat, or if anybody wants to unmute and ask questions, I'm happy to take them.
The first question, I don't know if you saw that in the chat, was wondering if you talk a little bit about the native bees and the bee houses.
Anything in particular?
Doesn't state that in the chat, so I'm not sure.
So I might have hit on that at the end. They are a great way to house native bees, and I think, you know, just like it's like planting a seed. You know, creating habitat is an act of faith, right? There's no guarantee that you're going to get them. So I guess in addition to the other stuff that I mentioned already, I would just say that, you know, sometimes you'll get things, sometimes you won't right away. So, you know, sometimes you'll have the perfect habitat. It still takes years. Sometimes they find it right away. It's hard to know. You will see wasps going in there sometimes. There are groups of wasps, of solitary wasps, that use hollow wood cavities as well. They are really good beneficial predators, and I would not discourage them necessarily. They're also very unlikely to sting because they're solitary. So they're just not like yellow jackets or paper wasps. Some of those are really cool. They have really cool behaviors. There's a whole group of wasps that are grass carrying wasps. So they line their nest with long grass stems. And you know, if you see grass just bulging out of one of the reeds, it's one of those really cool grass carrying wasps. So that's super fun as well. And so, and you know, they'll appear inactive a lot of the year for the reasons that I talked about, which is that their life cycle is closely timed to earlier mid-season flowering, and then the rest of the year they're holed up developing inside there. So you'll see, you know, earlier mid-season activity, and then it just hangs out the rest of the year.
Great, thank you. There was a question from Chris. I'll go ahead and unmute you, Chris. Okay. Then also a question from Barbara Smith.
Hello.
Hello.
Oh, good. Okay. That was a fantastic presentation. I just absolutely loved it. Thank you for being and coming and talking to us as well. That's all I wanted to say. It was just fascinating. So
well,
thank you
very much. I am very happy to be here, and I really appreciate the chance to give talks at a time when it can be hard to give talks. So yeah, I'm glad we had the chance.
Yeah, you're very knowledgeable. Thank you.
Thanks very much for posting those links in the chat. I see those there as I'm scrolling through. Thanks for doing that.
Yeah, not a problem. Felipe, you had a question.
I'll do another one as well.
Yes, so since I started beekeeping and having hives in my backyard, I have noticed an increase in population of wasps and different forms of wasps and yellow jackets. It's kind of a two-part question. One of them is, there's any of them that are harmful to my beehives, and if there are, how can I potentially, with integrated pest management or any way, to avoid killings, the ones that are not harmful to my apiary, but also I don't want to eliminate, but keep it under control and keep the wasps and or that are beneficial.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I will start by just, I do want to put a constraint on it, which is you folks are more knowledgeable about the honeybee side of things. And so one of the things I'm not super familiar with, for example, is a list of the different predators and parasitoid type species of honeybees. I've seen some really interesting photos of different flies kind of posting outside honeybee hives, and I think they're waiting to get in and maybe lay eggs, and we kind of brood parasites and stuff. And I don't have an excellent handle on what the local list of those is. So I can't answer as directly as I would like to. I'd like to be able to say these are the ones to look out for. In general, I don't know of many native wasps that are going to predate on, like, get into the beehive and do significant damage, partly because honeybees aren't native. And so they're just not used to looking for that resource. They're not evolved to look for that. And I would pose as an example of the other side of that, the Japanese Asian giant hornets, right? Which are co-evolved with honeybees, and so do know how to take one of those hives down and shop. And they're nowhere near us, by the way. It's just an example of something that really does do that. In our area, because they're not evolved with honeybees, I don't think there's many that do that. Exceptions to that would be things that are more generalist predators, large generalist wasps. I can't think of many, but if there was a larger generalist wasp, it would probably tag a bee right off a flower. So it would tag individuals, but only the adults. And the only other animal that really targets bees, there's a type of robber fly, which is a predatory fly that preys on things as adults. And there are groups of them that are called bee killers, but they, again, only prey on the adults. I cannot think of anything that does prey on the larvae. My guess is that the wasps are attracted to the smell of they may be trying to do some honey robbing, especially in the late summer and early fall, when their otherwise present nectar sources dry up. And they get the pitch that I give for paper wasps and yellow jackets is that they get old in the late summer and they get cranky and they're hungry and they're dying, and so they're really aggressive. They're really more likely to do that sort of stuff in the late summer. Even then, I would be surprised if it would pose a significant risk to a healthy hive. So that's only semi-educated opinion on that stuff, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head that would pose a real risk.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm putting in the chat right now a link to a front and back page native bee guide for Nevada that we made as part of Nevada Bugs and some other folks at Fish and Wildlife and Pollinator Partnership. And some of those photos are from the co-authors of The Bees in Your Backyard. So I went over that kind of short bee, I kind of did that crash course. So that contains a lot of that information.
Great, thank you for that. I don't see any more other hands. It looks like there was one other question from Jed, but I believe that was answered with your link and what you stated there.
Awesome. Yeah, strong hives. That comment is a good integrated pest management comment. Health is the bottom of the prevention tactic, right? And so, especially with plants, that's what I always tell people is healthy plants, right? Insect pests prey on diseased plants. So the same goes for honeybees, where a strong hive is going to be a good defense.
Okay, Kevin, that was awesome presentation. I'd like to plug your, since you're a founder of the Nevada Bugs and Butterflies, organization, could you talk a little bit about that and how people can help you in your effort to save the pollinators and
Yeah.
all that?
Yeah, so, just like everything else in the world right now, we're in our own little state of transition. We are in early stages of partnering with Truckee Meadows Parks Foundation to do more of our summer and field season programming at a property that they're now managing in Southeast Reno. And so we hope to build and open that in 2021. There were thoughts of doing it late this summer, but we're not doing that for, I think, obvious reasons. So that'll be coming in 2021. You can keep an eye out for our summer programming, which will be family and school-oriented programming out there on that site in Southeast Reno. We're super excited about that. It's a beautiful place. We typically do school outreach events and community events like the Reno Earth Day, all of which are on hold. So those things will be going as we get going again and can find ways to do them safely. And then just to tell you what else we're doing, we actually got a small contract from a state agency, the Nevada Natural Heritage Program, to resurvey butterfly diversity in the White Mountains of Nevada. So those are the mountains that are east of Bishop and on the far kind of central west side of the state. And there are 8 or 9 species that are rare or at least rare within the state. And we're also surveying general butterfly diversity. And last season we found, I think, 45 or 46 species of butterflies there, which is pretty phenomenal. Pretty great, good time. And we'll be going back there again to this season with the goal of reaching Boundary Peak, among other things, to survey. There's some high elevation skipper butterflies that like to hang out on the mountain peaks. And so we're gonna go in search of those this summer. So we do take donations, and we always appreciate if folks feel like they like to donate to the organization. We put that work towards our ability to go out and do those surveys and our ability to do community outreach, which, while limited right now, will be ramping up in the coming years. So the main thing I would say is for people to stay tuned in the spring of 2021 as our ability to hold public events really ramps back up, hopefully. I think that'll be a really fun time for folks to be involved with the community.
Okay, that's awesome. I'm going to wrap this up for your part of the meeting, Kevin. Thank you so much for returning, and it was a great presentation. Man, just so much information.
Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate everybody tuning in, and just to have it last there, I've just put my email into the chat, so if anybody thinks of questions later on, they can jot that down and write.
Okay, thanks again, Kevin. Maybe we'll see you next year.
Really appreciate it. Yes, definitely, anytime.
2021.
Have a great rest of your spring. Enjoy the flower season. It's going to be great.
Too. All right, bye.
Yeah, bye.
Okay, looks like we're down to 25 participants right now. Yeah, so I've got a few things to pass, general information for the club, for the members, and then I'm going to open it up for questions and answers. So there is extraction equipment available, and if anybody's interested in borrowing that from Pam G, her phone number is 775-233-6886. So honey harvest season is upon us. I've already extracted 10 gallons. I think Stefan extracted 400 pounds worth or something like that. Some incredible amount already. So we have to start thinking about that. And then speaking of Stefan, he is putting together a small queen grafting class. It's going to be very limited attendance, probably 4 or 5 people. If you're interested in doing that, text Stefan at 503-851-1794. And just text him and see what, I'm not sure when it's going to be, and I'm not sure he even knows when it's going to be exactly, but late season queen rearing is apparently the thing lately. So it's supposed to be very good for your colony, and you get an extra queen. So let's see. The next thing I need to talk about is the library is closed until the end of August. So definitely we will not be having an in-person meeting in July or August. So we're going to do a Zoom conference again, Zoom meeting in both those months. And the next thing I need to talk about is the club paid Richard R. to raise a bunch of sweet clover, Russian olive, Rocky Mountain bee plants, sandfoin, and alfalfa. So we're going to have about 25 of those potted plants available for pickup in the near future. And I want to limit that to 3 potted plants per family. So they're going to be available for pickup in Reno, and that'll be at a future date, probably later this week, is my guess. And then Deborah Q is offering oxalic acid vaporization treatment services. If you're interested in that, her number is 510-258-4361. So treatment season's fast approaching. I usually treat right after I pull honey, which is at the end of July, first week of August. And you want to get those treatments ordered as quick as possible. There's been a huge increase in demand for beekeeping equipment this year because of COVID. So most of the major suppliers are back ordered on basic equipment, even like suits, veils, gloves, hive tools, boxes, frames. They're back ordered on a lot of equipment, the hardware. So if you're thinking about treatments, this is the time to order your treatments for mites. And let's see, I've got some examples of what I use. You can get a bigger screen. Like, I'm not sure how to show. Well, I'm not a host, so this is oxalic acid, and I bought this 2-pound package about 6 years ago, and I still have about a pound left. I've treated maybe 100 colonies with that. So this is another product that I use quite regularly. It's backwards on Apivar. So this is my go-to after I extract honey in the summertime. And then a lot of people are going to formic acid. So this is the Formic Pro, but there's various formic acid products on the market. So those are 3 examples of some mite treatments that are very effective, and they're all available. Well, the oxalic acid I got on eBay, and it was 2 pounds was $9 delivered, and the company is Florida Laboratories Incorporated. So, and then obviously the go-to catalog that we promote, the company is Mad Lake. So there's other companies out there, but Mad Lake, I guess there's a branch in California now that delivers really quickly, but Mad Lake's always been their really fast service, and the catalog is pretty extensive. So that's all I think I needed to talk about. So I'm gonna open it up to. Well, I wanted to ask Emu how she did on the river this year. Did she have any issues with bears, and how was the bloom? So
Yes.
Emu, could you tell us how your bees are doing, and what's going on in all that area over there?
I'll be happy to. So I actually have a few photos to share. I don't know if that works. Host disabled screen sharing, so I'd like to screen share, please. Because yes, I had a bear. Very exciting.
Figuring out how to let you share.
Sorry?
I have to figure out how to let you share. Give me one moment here.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, in the meantime, I can maybe just start talking already. So I am a beekeeper in my 2nd year only. And I always wanted to have bees. And finally, when we moved here, we had a lot of land all of a sudden. And I wanted to have a garden. And we're very close to Toyabe National Forest with like lots of wildflowers. And we're by the Truckee River with lots of willows and antelope brush and rabbit brush. So we have all this pollen and nectar kind of in nature out there. So I decided that it's time to get honeybees finally. And I bought 2 hives in fall 1.5 years ago. And they made it through winter both. And I gave a little presentation last year how that went. So those 2 big hives in my first spring both swarmed. So, oh, now it's gonna work, yeah, okay. So, and I wanna tell you how this year went. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. So these are the 2 big hives that I bought when I first started, and I just want to talk about swarm control here, how I do mite control, how I mark the queen, that I keep records, and safety and bears. So this is my garden now. So I have now 5 big hives because I did splits last year. And most of my splits made it through winter. One died in early spring in one of those late snowstorms. I think it ran out of food because I'm very restrictive with pampering my bees. I think if they make it themselves, that's great. So a week split still died in spring here. But otherwise, I have 5 big hives now, and I'm very happy about it. And I'm making a lot of splits in spring to prevent my hives from swarming what they did last year to me. So you can see here, all these little boxes are my splits. First, I want to talk about the swarm control. So I usually tilt the boxes and just check for queen cells from the bottom. However, I did this photo just today, and then I looked through all the boxes, and I found still a queen cell here that I had missed by just tilting the box and checking from the bottom. So what I really do is I go through all my boxes, all my frames, to just prevent my hives from swarming. Because last year this was just such a little frustrating experience. So I check once a week, and it's really hard to do it sometimes with all other things going on. But the problem is if you don't check after 9 days, when the hive wants to swarm and they build a queen cell, in 9 days, this queen cell is capped, and once it is capped, the old queen leaves the hive and swarms. So you want to be faster than 9 days. So don't miss to go through your hive and check for queen cells. That's what I learned last year. I pull up all the frames. It's a lot of work, and I never roll a queen before, I think, but I really look through all the frames because I often have queen cells on the top of the frame that I could not see by just tilting the boxes. And then of course I crush those queen cells. And I make a lot of splits. So every week or every other week from a big hive, I take 1 frame out into a box, like a frame with eggs, and then I put another frame in with bees and 1 with food, and that's how I make my splits, and that's how I ended up with many, many splits this spring, and it's going well so far. So none of my big hives swarmed so far. What I also do for swarm control is checkerboarding. The chimney effect that Mike wrote in one of the newsletter where you have all the bees kind of in the middle, where you prevent that by just splitting it up and doing a full frame with bees and then an empty one and so on, so that they get better distributed over your boxes. And I mean, if nothing would help, you could consider moving a hive. I actually had to move a hive last fall because of the bear, and I just moved it like 40 yards in one night, and I did not have a problem. But this is independent of swarming, but it's just because people always say you cannot move a hive less than 2 miles, or you have to do inch by inch every day. I just moved it 40 yards a day, and it was no problem. And yeah, I just always keep in mind how long it takes for queens to evolve. It's really the fastest of all three bees to be evolving and be capped. So keep that in mind. You can be 1 week fine, miss one queen cell, and then the week later your hive swarmed. So be aware of that. Mite control, I put drone frames and always cut them. So from spring to fall, basically the whole year, I leave a drone frame. And recently I, on accident, had 2 drone frames in one big hive, and it's going well so far. So in very big hives, I just leave 2 drone frames and then always cut them and feed them to the chickens. Formic acid in spring, I did that last year, but I didn't do it this year, and I wanted to get Felipe's input on that because he once mentioned that he only treats with oxalic acid in fall, and I wanted to ask him if that's still enough with his bees. So I do the oxalic dribble in fall, and from late summer on, I check weekly for mites to see whether I have to do more treatment. And I try to keep my tools clean and replace frames because that's where the diseases also can spread, not only over the mites.
Just
What?
no, I'm just gonna answer your question. Yes, I only have been treating my bees on the fall, and my count has been very low, and I've only been using the oxalic acid vaporization method, and that has worked for my bees where I'm at in the North Valleys and in South Reno. Haven't had any issues with that, but I do inspect my hives just to make sure that my levels are going down or remaining at a good level.
Okay, thank you. Yep. So that's what I'm also trying to do, is because I don't want to do formic acid in spring, because maybe that was the reason why they swarmed last year on me. And I'm not a big fan of buying these hop guards and whatever they sell. And so I will try your method. I'll let you know. So I want to talk briefly about marking the queen, because last year's chaos was swarming and who's the new queen, who's an old queen. Then I had a re-swarm, then I caught a swarm. It was chaos, so I decided to mark my queen. And there is a international standard. So this year, where 2020 is blue, and I don't buy these fancy markers. I just take nail polish and do a little dip on it. And then that's how it looks. You see that here on the, I don't know if you see it. That's how I mark my queen. That's supposed to be green from last year, but that's how I mark my queens, and I'm pretty happy about it. So if I have a queen without a marking, I know that it must have swarmed, for example. And I'm a big fan of keeping records. I started that late last year, and I just made an Excel sheet, and I put in the dates, and if I saw the mark queen, yes, no, if I saw queen cells, eggs, larva, cap brood, how many mites, if I did a count. So I'm pretty happy because I cannot keep track of 5 hives anymore. So that's how it looks then that's a record from this spring. So it's a little chaotic, you cannot really read it, but here at Super, so I keep tracks of my hives, and then I also keep the tracks from last year. So for example, if I have a hive that dies on me, I can go back in my records and see, oh, yes, because maybe my mite count was too high and my treatment was too little. So I kind of, that helps me keeping track of my hives. And just a brief word about safety, and I'm almost done here. So we had a bear coming in the past eating a flock of chicken already 2 years ago, and last fall it really came and reached over the fence and grabbed off a super that I was about to like spin down the next week. And so I ordered from Amazon these solar powered sirens. They can blink or do a siren, and I just hung them all around our garden. So we're pretty much in the wilderness out there. So and we got a guard dog. She's outside in the night and guards everything, and she sleeps in the day in the house. And all the beehives are accessible for the dog now, so she can encircle everybody. And I hope that this fall we will be fine with bears. So thank you for listening. And I am also selling splits, so I always have this for sale, or I already sold some to people, and I'm giving away free splits to friends who want to start bees this year. So thanks, and just let me know.
Awesome, Emu. Looks like you're really succeeding for the second year. Man, you've really gone to town. So you started with 2, and you're looks like 5. Let's see. There's actually 7 colonies right there. 7.
Well,
I see 7.
In the background is hive number 1.
Oh, 8.
Then comes 2.
8.
But these are my splits: 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8 splits, and some of the boxes have more than one because I do separation walls to have several splits in one box because I'm running out of space.
Oh my goodness. That's wonderful. Yeah, God smited you with too many bees. It's a horrible thing to have too many bees, right? This year has been an incredible swarm season. Almost everybody's had to deal with swarms. I like your swarm technique. So just to reiterate, you go into all of your colonies and check each frame for queen cells?
Yes, because after last year, I'm just kind of I kind of learned my lesson, I think, and I'm very fast, you know. I mean, I'm looking just like a few seconds at each frame. I start at the bottom for queen cells, and I quickly just scan, and I just scan also for the queen, for eggs, for larvae, and so on. So I'm not gonna see like, oh, it's so beautiful. I'm spending very little time on each frame.
Right. And do you think the reason why they're swarming is because maybe you have a swarmy genetics, or is it swarmy because the nectar flow was so heavy and the amount of space that the queen had to lay wasn't that much? Is that why there's usually those are the 2 main reasons why colonies swarm, is because they run out of room or you just have swarmy genetics.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, the person where I got those initial 2 starter hives from also gave 1 hive to Stefan, and I think he also had swarms last year. I mean, I'm good this year, and I also moved those 2. So those were the ones in the corner where the bear got to them. So I moved them. They have a little bit more shade, maybe. I hope it's not the genetics, because that's where that's what I'm making my splits from, except that I'm maybe getting some better genetics over some drones from downtown when they mate, but otherwise that's what I got.
Was there a big nectar flow at your property there on the river this spring?
Not so much. I didn't harvest yet. I didn't spin down. I harvested some frames. I think I have a great pollen flow. We have lots of willows. Antelope brush went crazy this spring. Rabbit brush in fall is plenty. I'm not so sure about the nectar because my garden is not that big yet, and I saw lots of wildflowers when we went backpacking in those mountains to the right, the Toyabe National Forest.
Mm.
Tons of wildflowers, beautiful. I don't know if the nectar flow is that big.
Mm. Well, awesome presentation. Thank you so much, Emu. People have your number if they need bees.
Yes, and I actually also started helping some people looking through their hives. Some people who had who have hives and were not successful last year asked me if I can help them, and I also do that. So you can contact me too.
Great. Speaking of swarms, another member just texted me. His name is Ray, and he has a freshly caught swarm. If anybody would like it, he's got too many bees. He's in a what do they call it, HOA environment, where his CCNRs don't even allow beekeeping, but he's got 3 colonies now, and that's way too many. So his number, if you're interested in going out there and getting that swarm right now, is 530-414-0282. So it's been swarm season like crazy this year. So, okay. I'd like to open it up for questions and answers, for general questions and answers. Anybody have any specific questions about anything? Extraction. So I guess that's another thing we could talk about is extracting. I already mentioned there's club extraction equipment available at Pam G's, just text her. But there's also another method that's really not discussed in the book. Where's my book? So we use the Backyard Beekeeper as a pretty much guide for our beekeeping class. And it only talks about one method of extracting honey. It's mechanical extraction, which I thought was doesn't do justice so much. So mechanical extraction, they don't talk about the real easy method of crush and strain, using your hive tool and scraping the frames down into a filter material or a colander, and then have a catch basin below the colander for if you only have, say, 10 frames of honey this year, it doesn't make sense to dirty an extractor or buy an extractor. The best and easiest way is to do the crush and strain method. And I don't know, have you ever used that, Emu, the crush and strain method, or do you have an extractor?
I have an extractor, yes. Since last fall, someone gave up their entire equipment and gave it to me. I did it with Stefan. Stefan, what did we use last year? Was it just cut open and then spin? So
Yeah, so we just used a knife to cut the cappings off and then spin them. Basic, just like any other knife. Some people use a hot knife. I have this new tool I'm using this year that seems to be pretty awesome. That works out. It has these claws on it that cut really close to the top of the cappings, and it's so fast to get them off. But yeah, we used a knife last year.
And an extractor, Stefan?
yes.
Okay, so there's the crush and strain method if you only have, a few frames of honey that need to be extracted. So Spencer Erickson just typed in a chat message saying, I have 3 honey supers now and I'm going to extract soon. The hive is overflowing with bees and I'm concerned that when I take the supers off, the bees won't have space. I only have 1 extra super to put on while the others are removed. So my experience, Spencer, is that you should do it on as fast as possible. So have all your equipment ready to extract the supers. And then as soon as you're done, put them right back on during the daytime on a hot day, because a huge portion of your colony is going to be out foraging. And what you want to do is after you extract your honey supers, put those right back on your colony for them to clean it up. And that's my advice to you for keeping your bees from overflowing and giving them enough space. Any other questions?
So on that as well, something I've done recently is I've grabbed a milk crate, which was wide enough to hold the frame, but only holds about 8 frames in that milk crate. So you can use that to pull the full frames out, put empty ones back in the box, and then stick it on the hive so you don't have to worry about space.
Yeah, that's great. You don't have to pull all 3 honey supers off at once. You can do 1 super at a time and extract it and put it on the colony. Hopefully your extraction equipment is close to where your colony is, so I guess that would be the only limitation, but try to do it on a warm day when a lot of bees are foraging. It should be fine. Anybody else? Questions?
I did set it so you are able to unmute yourselves now.
How many are left on the meeting?
22.
Oh, okay. So another thing that's coming up is the picnic is scheduled for September 19th. It's going to be at the same location, and hopefully everybody will get plenty of honey, so we can do a nice honey tasting event, and then plan on having bee bingo as well. So that's September 19th, and usually starts about 1 or 2-ish, depending on how the barbecuing goes and all that. And please bring a side dish as well. I always enjoy the side dishes. I think everybody does. Yeah. Is everybody happy with the newsletters overall? Is there anything I can do to, improve it?
I really like it. I think they're very beneficial. I read them.
Okay. Is there anything I can add to it? So this is my first attempt, I really wasn't a member of any clubs that had newsletters in the past. So this is just my kind of effort to convey information. I was going to make a beekeeping calendar specific for Northern Nevada, but life got in the way with that. So it's still there, it's still in the back of my head. I can just take the information from the monthly newsletters and create a calendar pretty easily and post it on the website. Is there anything that another thing that's coming up as well. Mark, you're going to be starting a PayPal type club membership option for the website as well. So, and we're going to have a multi-year membership option also. So right now the membership is $25 a year. If you want to sign up for 2 years, it'll be like $45, something like that. And we're kicking around a 3-year membership, at say $60 or something like that. So there's going to be a multi-year membership option as well really soon. That'll be great especially for the March meeting. The March meeting is always madness. Okay. Anything else? Anything else going on? Anybody have any interesting bee stories? Deborah, how's your bees doing?
Bees are doing well. A lot of my mentees have had a very good year. So some have swarmed, some have successful splits. So, if you are a second-year member, I encourage you to help Stefan out and sign up to be a mentor, because now you are officially a beekeeper and can help those coming up in the ranks to share your knowledge and your experience like Emu did, because those things are very valuable to us here in Northern Nevada.
Yeah, I mentioned that in the newsletter. You know, our knowledge and experience is highly prized nowadays. So this COVID stuff has been, I've seen an amazing resurgence in like backyard gardening, fruit tree planting, sowing, canning, beekeeping. You know, it's just been. I guess that's a benefit of that's the only thing I can think of as the benefit with this pandemic, is that people are getting back into those kind of homesteading type hobbies, you know, and it's good. We are definitely skilled, right? We have great knowledge that people are, it's in high demand lately, beekeeping. So try to share that information with as many possible that approach you and say, yeah, I'm a beekeeper. I know what's going on here in Nevada, and kind of approach it with, you know, love thy neighbor attitude. And I think that's going to help everybody. Anybody else got anything? Okay, well, if nothing else, I think that's a wrap. Kevin Burrows is an incredible speaker. We're really blessed to have him come back this year. It was, oh, yeah, it was, so Barbara just sent a chat. She caught 13 swarms this spring. Probably, maybe some, I don't know how far she is from you even. You didn't have very swarms this year, huh? Only last year in the spring.
Yeah.
You're swarm free. 13 swarms. I'm sure she ran out of equipment. So what I did, surprisingly, I don't think Barbara expected this, but what I did was I reverse alphabetized the swarm list. So, you know, all the A's and the B's and the C's, they were getting all the swarms for years and years on this swarm list. So what I did last year was I reverse alphabetized it. So Barbara Smith was right there at the top. So she on the drop down swarm call list. Yeah, it just overwhelmed her. So yeah, Eddie Rhodes probably really appreciated it.
Maybe you can do a system where you say Mondays call A, Tuesdays call B, so it's more distributed.
Yeah, maybe. So say again, Emu, how can I do that on the swarm list? It's like Monday.
Mondays call this person, Tuesdays call the next person, and so on.
Okay, I'll think about that. I think these people that have swarms are just in such a panic mode. They probably don't even know what day it is. Like, I need somebody like yesterday. Get out here. Like, don't even stop to get gas. Come get these bees. So yeah. But I'm gonna go back. So I'll switch it up every couple of years. I think I'll do the I'll do an alphabetized list. You know, starting with A's again here, probably next year. But I just wanted everybody to get a fair shake, because Dan Bailey was getting all the swarm calls for years and years. Yeah, and Casales and all that. So anyway, that's just a tidbit. Well, I'm going to wrap it up then. Thank you, Emu, for your awesome presentation, and thank you everybody for participating, you know, in this first ever Northern Nevada Beekeepers Association Zoom meeting. I think it was a success. Thumbs up. I got a thumbs up from Nettie. Thumbs up for Stefan. So it looks like everybody's crossed the 4 thumbs up. Okay, awesome. Okay, we'll see you next month. Everybody take care, and hope your bees do great and bring in plenty of honey. Talk to you later.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.